So, learning tech. Unsurprisingly, the learning technology market has been going through one of its biggest revolution periods since the early 2000s. In fact, the report estimates the entire sector's worth in the region of $20 billion by itself. And as we think about that, we start wondering, actually, within this space, we now have access to 22 different learning-focused tools. Now, I don't know about you, but when you think about that, you probably are wondering to yourself, how do I handle all of those? How do I get the most out of them? Or on the other end of the spectrum, kind of going, well, hang on a minute, what do I do if I've only got one? And how do I put that to work? The truth of the matter is, fundamentally, if you think about your tool or think about your platform, make sure it has a specific purpose and it's contributing actively to the economic engine of the organization. Now, over the course of his career, as I've brought up on the slide here, Josh has constantly referred back to what he calls about the evolution of learning and using it as a benchmark to kind of judge where we are as an organization. And if you could, JP is going to put up a survey now, and I'd like you to just select where your business is currently focusing on. Learning in the flow of work, capability academies, and I can see there's a huge focus at the moment on e-learning and blended. And in fact, coming up a close second is your digital learning and the principle of 70-20-10. Now, when it comes to actually where Josh thinks we should be, Josh, in fact, says the majority of us are about 10 years behind where we could be, which is somewhat scary. And actually, much of the conversation is now centering around this principle of learning in the flow of work. And as I can see some people want to take some pictures of that. So if you want to look at that, there you go. And they refer to learning in the flow of work. And I was curious for you, if you can just drop into the chat, what does learning in the flow of work actually mean to you? What do you think of when I say that, learning in the flow of work? What does it mean as a statement? And if you're anything like me, you'll be thinking about, okay, how do you make it accessible, learning on the job, learning in your work, trying new things, peer review. And actually, if you think about this and you think about the operationalization, which I can't even say, of this, immobilization, I should say, of this in your organizations, the most common mistake that we make is we think about the flow of work for our HR function or our head office team, when in reality, it's our frontline people that are driving the economic engine of the organization. And in order to give us some guiding principles, Josh has built out effectively a map of the learning ecosystem. And that's essentially what the learning tech is becoming. It's becoming this infrastructure that collaborates together. Now, a word of caution. I do not want you, after this call, to go out and try and buy a platform that sits in every one of these categories. I dread to think what the call with your CFO might be if you go and try and do this. But rather think, what is going to help connect you and enable your business's endgame? What's going to connect you most effectively into the economic engine of the organization? So let's break a couple of these down. So the first couple could be categorized together. And it was one of the sort of core shifts in the learning space and the emergence of the LXP, or the program delivery platforms, where at the beginning, and they are now beginning to supersede and replace what was the legacy LMS system, offering really complex recommendation algorithms and engines that help connect people to content that is perceived to be more relevant to their roles. But Josh has a word of warning with this, and I'll quote directly from the report here. While I'm a huge fan of the LXP, it's a means to an end. The LXP doesn't train you at all. It helps you find and arrange the training that you need. And while the whole idea of the Netflix of content seemed great a few years ago, the real power is in the content itself, not the recommendation engine. And continuing, he says, in some ways, they were defined to be in the flow systems, and in reality, they're more like YouTube. Easy and fun to use, highly engaging, but fall short in terms of context, and not particularly good for progressive learning experiences. So whilst we can have a great content library, which is searchable and does actually provide access to content that drives skill and capability, the question you constantly need to come back to is it addressing the core needs of the organization? Which brings us to the next section. And those of you that know me know that I can literally pontificate for hours on end about the benefits of microlearning in a completely un-microlearning way. So it actually genuinely filled me with quite a lot of pride. And in the interest of being pragmatic, I'll use Josh's words to quote from the report about how he recognizes Axonify and how it is used as a benchmark within the microlearning sector. And he says, Axonify can deliver training to a worker in a prescribed and intelligent path in 5-minute chunks a day. It can then ask the learner how confident he or she feels about that material. Then through machine learning algorithms, the system can give you just enough learning to finish that goal. And in his words, Axonify is truly learning in the flow of work. But it's actually an earlier sentence that I wanted to come back to, which is the system can give you just enough learning to finish that goal. And therein lies the core definition of thinking about the environment that your frontline people are within. Essentially, they are trying to get into a system, access what they need, and get back out again. And if you think about it this way, microlearning is essentially optimized to help you in the role you're in now. Macro learning, which is slightly longer form, so think classrooms, hours on end, and development, is actually designed to evolve the next version of you or the evolution of you. And quite frankly, if you're interested in that conversation, go and have a chat with Hazel or Chris. Next up, so the content library. Now, sometimes it is genuinely useful to have access to a MOOC, and they can be quite useful for building out that macro skill. The challenge is that in this current new environment, we very, very rarely have the time for it. And whilst it makes content available, is it actually giving you as a learning function the return that you need to justify that investment? And actually over the last 18 months, we saw this progressive trend towards self-directed learning where clients were layering more and more content into their content libraries. But as we come out of the core of the pandemic, we actually find that we have far more agile, lean teams, which in reality means we just don't have the time to engage. The intent was right, but again, is it giving and delivering on the end game that you actually need? Now, as Hazel has already alluded to, the sixth section, which is actually presented as one of the slimmest in the actual overall chart, could be a bit of a game changer and is genuinely something that I don't think the majority of us even knew existed, let alone used it as part of our day-to-day. And the one to watch, as far as Josh is concerned, is Microsoft Teams, which can genuinely be something that integrates into the everyday infrastructure of where we operate. And based on the feedback we've already received, we're going to be looking for active ways about how we can feed that back to you. Okay, so before we wrap up, and before we look at the final section, we have to give a mention to what Josh refers to as the learning basement, and which is where you'll find your legacy LMS systems, your learning record center, and his advice and his take on this is leave them where they are. Until you have the opportunity to or have the need to, don't swap them out, allow them to continue to do what they have been doing for many, many years around delivering your compliance training, delivering that mandatory content that you might have to go through for whatever regulatory reason. So this final section, before I hand back to Hazel, and it's something that if you do take the time to read the full report, Josh talks an awful lot about how we can assess the skill that can build the capabilities that we need. And there's three core tools that he actually refers to that we can use consistently. One, unsurprisingly, is assessments and psychometrics, which we're really excited to be getting closer and closer to some of the evolving platforms in that space. Peer review, so think about essentially how you're using the crowd to source feedback and observations of what's happening. Now, naturally, that can be quite subjective and quite heavily laden with recency bias. Inference and AI, so I think about how you can use platforms to infer skill through LinkedIn. But one of the technologies that we are most excited about, and actually one of the technologies that's bringing reliability and actually scalability to all three of these, is the emergence of virtual reality. And if you've been watching Hazel's social media feed, you'll see just how excited we are about the partnership that we've just relaunched in the region with Jensen 8's multiplayer VR, which brings together assessment, peer impact and review, collaboration, all along with machine learning and psychometrics, all into the same assessment and development space. which, as you heard, is challenging enough to say, let alone try and explain. So if you would like to, tell me more in the comments, or actually, now that you can, pop over to Biz and we'll show you the lab. Okay, to summarize, let me again use a quote from Josh Bersin, and he refers to the biggest evolution and disruption of all, and it refers to us as a team. You have to flip your L&D teams into agile design thinking operations. We can't just buy content and publish it to get value. We need to architect the systems that enable these new technologies and apply them directly to the job role and business problems that we're facing, which ultimately brings us full circle back to where we started and how Hazel introduced this session, which is always have an end game.